There's a fella named Larry McMurtry wrote a book about Texas called Lonesome Dove. And if you've ever read that book, you may remember toward the end of it, it's on page 877 in my paperback copy, there's a scene where one of the characters, Woodrow Call, says to his dying partner, Augustus McCrae, "This would make a story if there was anybody to tell it." He's talking, of course, about Gus's request that Woodrow carry his body all the way back from Montana, 3,000 miles to Texas, by wagon, and bury him along the banks of his beloved Guadalupe River, and about Gus's wanting to leave half his herd to some lady friend. Well, now, you've got to wonder sometimes how folks like McMurtry come up with these far-fetched, even bizarre ideas about an old boy getting shot up by the Indians, being mortally wounded, and knowing he's dying, and then making his partner promise to take his body all the way back to Texas, and about his partner doing it, after letting that body winter over while he finishes a cattle drive. Well, I'm here to tell you, folks, that McMurtry didn't just make that story up, because something very much like that really did happen once to a couple of old boys from Texas just right after the Civil War. Only the fellow who got shot up by the Indians, his name was Oliver, and he and his partner Charlie were trailing a herd up from Texas to New Mexico. See, Oliver and a cowboy named One-Armed Bill Wilson had decided to ride out ahead of the herd and go on up to Santa Fe to do a little negotiating. Now, mind you, they'd swung way out west along the Pecos River so as to avoid the Comanche country upwards through the Panhandle, but the Comanches found them anyway, and set out after Oliver and One-Armed Bill Wilson. The two men took cover along the banks of the Pecos, but in the fracas, Oliver got wounded in the arm and in the side, and he knew after that he wasn't much good for traveling in the shape he was in, so Oliver insisted that One-Armed Bill Wilson make a run for it and try to get back to the crossing where Charlie would be coming with the herd. "Stay close to the riverbanks, Bill," Oliver said, "and get to that crossing and tell Charlie what happened." So One-Armed Bill Wilson did that. He followed the Pecos River where they'd taken refuge, stayed close to the banks all the way back down to the crossing, and hid out in a cave until Charlie got there. Oh, and when Charlie heard about the ambush, why, he left that herd and rode all night to get to where Oliver was. Only Oliver wasn't there anymore, and all Charlie found was about 100 arrow shafts sticking out of that river bank. Because, you see, after he'd waited a couple of days, Oliver had decided that if he didn't bleed to death, he might just starve to death, because he hadn't eaten anything for days by this time. So he decided to try to make it to the crossing himself and started upstream along the river. But weak as he was, he pooped out pretty quick and made it only as far as some shade under a chinaberry tree. He leaned himself back against the trunk of that tree, and that's where 3 men found him. Those 3 men had a wagon, and Oliver asked them if they'd take him on into Fort Sumner, the closest town, just across the New Mexico line. They said sure they would, for $250. Well, Oliver had the $250, paid them, and they hauled him into Fort Sumner and got him to a doctor. When Charlie found out that Oliver was alive after all and where he was, Charlie left that herd again and rode hell-bent for leather to Fort Sumner and the bedside of his friend and partner. Meanwhile, gangrene had set in Oliver's wounded arm, and they'd had to amputate it right above the elbow. Then later an artery broke and had to be retied, and Oliver's condition just went from bad to worse after that, and he knew his time was near. So he asked Charlie for his word on 2 things. One, he asked Charlie to continue their partnership for 2 more years so as to settle all of Oliver's debts and take care of his family. But there wasn't much in the way of life insurance in those days, of course. And 2, Oliver asked Charlie to take his body back to Texas to be buried in his home cemetery at Weatherford. "I don't want to be buried here in Fort Sumner," Oliver said. "I want to go home. Take me home, Charlie. Take me home." And Charlie promised. And you know there wasn't a lawyer in that room, and they didn't sign any pieces of paper, because that was back in the days when a man's word was his bond. Then Oliver died, and they buried him right there in Fort Sumner. Because remember now, Charlie still had cattle to trail up north to sell off. It took him 5 months, from September to the next February, to get that done and get back to Fort Sumner. When he got back to fetch Oliver home, Charlie had some of the cowhands rig up a kind of a metal cylinder, and they dug Oliver up and slid his coffin into that metal container and packed all around it with powdered charcoal. That was to keep the smell of death from hovering over that coffin when they loaded Oliver up on a wagon to take him home to Texas. So Charlie got Oliver home all right and saw to it that he was buried in his home cemetery there in Weatherford, with full Masonic Lodge services. And every little bit, Charlie was back in Weatherford over the next 2 years, seeing to it that Oliver's debts were paid off and that his family was taken care of. Altogether, Charlie paid out half of $72,000 in accumulated trail earnings. Charlie kept his promises. And this is a story that's worth telling, even in its slightly altered fictional form by writers like Larry McMurtry. But mostly we need to be telling the real story about the real people to whom it happened. To Oliver, that's Oliver Loving, of course, and his partner Charlie, Charles Goodnight. Together they blazed the Goodnight Loving Trail, and Goodnight went on to blaze 4 more trails before he was done, so they're important historically for sure. But even more importantly, their story illustrates the lengths to which men will go, to which people will go, when they have promises to keep, even if they have miles to go before they sleep. You know, the thing that's so remarkable about old Blue is that he was almost like a cat. He had so many lives. Only he wasn't a cat. He was a longhorn. A Texas longhorn. He was born down on the Nueces River near the Texas coast back in the spring of 1870. He got his name, of course, from the color of his hair, kind of a streaky blue. Longhorns, you know, don't have to be any particular color like the red-haired, white-faced Herefords or the black Angus. No, a longhorn might be, well, nearly any color, black or brown or white or red, or that yellow we call dun. Why, they've even got one down there in Austin that's burnt orange. They call him Bevo. Or longhorns can be brindled or paint or smoky or speckled or blue. Now, they say Blue's mother was pretty wild, but from the start, Blue showed a real gentle disposition. When he turned 3, he was put in a herd going west to New Mexico over the Goodnight Loving Trail. And that's kind of interesting because eventually Blue was going to wind up belonging to Charles Goodnight, who helped blaze that trail and several others while he was at it, but that comes later in the story. Well, the first 2 of Blue's lives got tested right there on the Goodnight Loving Trail, which ran up to and along the Pecos River. You see, it was quite a challenge in that 96 miles of it were without water for man or beast. And when they did get in sight of the Pecos River, after 2 days and 3 nights in the desert, more or less, the cattle were going to be real thirsty, and they'd bolt for the first water they saw. And all too often that turned out to be the alkali lakes east of the river, and if they got there and drank that water, why, they'd poison themselves to death. So if the cowboys hadn't known how to manage this particular herd Blue was in, he might have died right there. But the cowboys did know how to manage, and so Blue didn't die. And that's one. Now, you may have to help me keep score here, okay? Well, they hadn't even gotten away from the Pecos River yet when they had to contend with the Comanches, who swooped down on them right there just above Horsehead Crossing, stampeded the cattle, got away with 600 head or so. But they didn't get Blue. So that's 2. No, he and the rest of the remaining herd made it another 100 miles and were sold to John Chisholm at the Bosque Grande Ranch. The next fall, it was the Apaches out after cattle, and this time Blue had a pretty close call. One morning, as a matter of fact, a cowboy found Blue with an arrow in his side. But you know they cut that arrow out, and the sore healed up pretty quickly, and Blue didn't seem to be much the worse for it. And that's 3. He was turning out to be a pretty tough old longhorn, all right. It was the next spring that Charles Goodnight bought Blue and 5,000 more steers from John Chisholm, divided them into 2 herds, and trailed them up to the Arkansas River above Pueblo, Colorado, where Goodnight had a ranch at that time. Blue went in the first herd. He was a grown steer now, 4 years old, and he'd seen a lot of the world by this time and was trail-hardened, and it turned out he was a natural-born leader. Every morning he took his place at the head of that herd, and he kept it. He was powerful and sober and steady, and he seemed to understand the least little motion of the point men, and sure enough helped guide that herd. Why, they said he was worth a dozen men out on the trail, and by doing that he probably saved his life again. And what are we up to now? 4? Because, you see, instead of sending Blue on up to feed the Indians at some agency in Wyoming, as he was doing with the other steers, Goodnight cut him out, kept him right there on his Colorado ranch. Then danged if the cattle thieves didn't come along and make off with Blue that winter. Goodnight thought he was a goner for sure. Fortunately, though, it was Goodnight himself who was out tracking a little bunch of strays through the snow when he found Blue and about a dozen other steers in a makeshift corral hidden in the middle of a thicket. Nearby was a pile of hides peeled from some of those stolen cattle, but once again, Blue had escaped. That's 5. This time escaped being butchered and having his hide taken off. Well, by the summer of 1876, Goodnight had decided to move back to Texas. He was going to risk the Indians and start a ranch in the wide Texas Panhandle, where as yet no white man had settled. So with 6 cowboys, he rounded up 1,600 head of cattle and pointed the herd for Paladura Canyon. And in the lead was Blue. Paladura Canyon, of course, is the Grand Canyon of Texas, the second largest canyon in the United States. A great twisting gash across the rolling plains, it's 11 miles from bluff to bluff at its widest point. And the Paladura stream flows many hundreds of feet below the tops of those bluffs. Between the high canyon walls within the canyon itself are hills and mesas and valleys, just covered with brush and grass. So the Paladura had water and forage, and those high walls offered some protection from the harsh panhandle winters. The only problem was, you had to get down in it. The Goodnight cowboys drove Blue and his herd single file down a trail that had been used by the Indians for centuries. But they had to unload their wagon, with enough provisions for 6 months, take the wagon to pieces, and carry the parts down on mules. That took 2 days. Then they had to put the wagon back together, load it up, and drive it on downstream. Meanwhile, working up ahead of the cattle, Goodnight and his men had to drive the buffalo, about 10,000 of them, out of that part of the canyon where they wanted to put the cattle. Then some of the cowboys rode herd to keep the buffalo out and the cattle in the valley, while the others built a ranch house out of cedar logs, the first ranch home in what would become 26 counties. The Comanches, of course, were used to camping in Paladura, and a hungry band of them rode in one day wanting beef. Well, Goodnight saw to it that they got beef, but not Blue. So Blue was spared again, and that's 6. Meanwhile, Goodnight entered into a partnership with an Englishman named John Adair, and within the next 10 years put together a ranch that controlled 1,000,000 acres of land and upwards of 75,000 cattle. Since Adair put up most of the money, they used the J.A. brand, of course, and called it the J.A. Ranch, and it is still that to this very day. The nearest market for the J.A. cattle was Dodge City, Kansas, known far and wide as the cowboy capital. It was 250 miles to the north, and that was also the nearest railroad station. And you know, at that time there was nary a fence to be crossed between the Paladura and Dodge City. When the J.A. Ranch was 2 years old, a herd of 1,000 fat steers broke the first cattle trail out of the Panhandle bound for Kansas. Blue was in the lead, as always, but this trip was different. Always the innovator, Goodnight decided to try something. You know, he'd already invented the chuck wagon, and now he was going to try having him a bell steer. Lots of ranchers drove horses with a bell mare to lead. He figured it ought to work for cattle, too. So he rigged a clean, fresh collar with the smell of new leather and put a shiny new bell on it. And you know, when Blue got that collar around his neck and heard that clear clanging of his bell, well, he appeared to be about as proud as a ranch boy stepping out in his first pair of red-top boots. What's more, the cattle soon learned to follow the sound of Blue's bell. Now, the cowboys had attached a little strap to it that could be used to tie up the clapper. So at night, or at grazing times during the day, one of the cowboys would pitch a rope over Blue's horns, then walk up to him and strap that clapper so the bell wouldn't sound. And as for Blue, after leading 1,000 steers around all day, when he was off duty, he believed in taking life easy. He pretty well considered himself to be a privileged character around the camp, and he'd walk right in amongst the pots and pans and eat pieces of bread or meat or prunes or anything the cook would give him, or anything the cowboys could steal from the cook to give him. He became a great pet. Sometimes the cowboys would just hobble him and let him graze with the saddle horses, or they might stake him out on a long rope, as he preferred to bed down away from the other cattle. Come morning, though, Blue would nose his way out toward one of the point men, who'd loosen the clapper on the bell. Then off he'd go again, headed north. When that first herd from the Paladura reached the Cimarron River, it was on a rampage. But Blue just shouldered into it, and after him trailed the 1,000 J.A. cattle. He left it up to the cowboys to get the chuck wagon across. And when they got to the Arkansas River, that was just south of Dodge City, and a cold December wind was blowing, and the north sky was black. So the cowboys left their horses saddled when they made camp that night, because they expected trouble before daylight. Sure enough, about midnight, a storm of sleet and snow moved in, hit that herd. The cattle wanted to drift. But the cowboys mounted up and became a kind of human drift fence themselves and held those cattle like a wall. At daybreak, the trail boss said, "Untie old Blue's clapper and let's take the river." Well, the water by now was frozen out from the banks of the river, but with Blue in the lead, the steers broke through the ice and swam the icy current. When they reached the other side, though, they were invigorated. They felt like running, and faster they crowded old Blue. Now think of it, 1,000 cattle. That's 2,000 of those big old long horns clacking and 4,000 feet a roaring. Oh, the frozen ground fairly shook, and Blue could have been trampled. But he wasn't, and that's 7. Because, you see, Blue had the speed of a racehorse himself, and still at the head of his herd, he led them straight for the gate that opened into the big shipping pens. Before noon, they were all loaded and on their way to Chicago. All, of course, except old Blue. Blue stayed with the remuda and ate hay with the horses while the cowboys celebrated in Dodge City. The next morning they loaded the wagon with chuck and sacks of shell corn, and on the road home old Blue got some of that corn, and he liked it too. After that first trip up the trail as a bell steer, Blue's occupation for life was settled. For 8 years, old Blue kept leading herds, some years making 2 trips to Dodge City. All told, probably 10,000 head or more of the J.A. cattle followed him and his bell from the Paladura to Kansas, and he continued to make himself useful until he died at age 20. As a kind of testimony to this longhorn survivor, the J.A. cowboys nailed his horns up over the ranch house door, and those same horns are hanging now in the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon, Texas. If you ever go there to see them for yourself, maybe you'll remember that here was a Texas longhorn who had at least 7 lives.
I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the sod. Twice have I stood a beggar before the door of God. Emily Dickinson wrote those lines about 1858 up in Amherst, Massachusetts, but they apply just as well to a Texas woman living at about the same time. Her story of double loss begins in 1836. It is May. She is 9 years old. She is called Cynthia Ann or Cindy Ann. Oh, and she's a pretty little thing with blonde hair and blue eyes. Already her life is exciting. She's a pioneer, come here to the banks of the Navasota River with her family and a small group of settlers, about 30 in all, headed up by her grandfather, a hard-shell Baptist called Elder John. They built a settler's fort and planted corn outside its walls. Little Cindy Ann had learned to do her share of work as a child of pioneers. She fed the chickens and helped her mother with household chores and helped take care of her 3 younger siblings. And she was happy there, secure in her child's faith and trust that her parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles would take care of her and keep her safe. Then one spring afternoon, all that changed, and little Cindy Ann experienced real loss for the first time. It was just past the middle of May, and the bluebonnets had already gone to seed. The Texans had lost their battle at the Alamo, but they'd won at San Jacinto just about a month ago. In truth, however, little of that really mattered at the settlers' fort. They worried less about the likes of Santa Anna and more about raiding Comanches in Kiowa. Yet on this particular day in May, the gates of the fort were open, and most of the men were outside the fort working in the cornfields. Only 5 or 6 men remained inside with the women and children. We might imagine that Cindy Ann was outside, feeding the chickens maybe, holding the chicken feed in her gathered apron or skirt and throwing it about on the ground and clucking for the old hens to come, when she might have seen a band of Indians ride up. She wouldn't be alarmed necessarily, because the Indians were carrying a dirty white flag, and she knew that was a sign of truce. But she would be curious, and she would watch as one man, her uncle Benjamin, went out to parley with the Indians. She might even have overheard when her Uncle Benjamin came back inside the fort and told his brother, Cindy Ann's daddy, Silas, that the Indians had asked for water and beef. Benjamin also said he thought they were hostile and looking for trouble. Nevertheless, her Uncle Benjamin walked back outside, accompanied this time by Silas, and Cindy Ann's curiosity would turn to horror and fear, for the Indians killed Benjamin, ran him through with lances, perhaps because he told them he had no beef for them, perhaps because they were, as he said, just looking for trouble. Silas, of course, turned and ran for the still open gates of the fort, but he didn't make it. He was cut down by a barrage of arrows. Then the Indians rode through those open gates, whooping and hollering. They killed the rest of the men, including Elder John, and assaulted all the women they caught, and they caught most of them. But Cynthia Ann's mother, Lucy, had the presence of mind to gather up her children and run for the back gate of the fort, knowing if they got through that and across the clearing behind it, they could hide in the protective cover along the river. They made it to the gate and through the gate, and they were running and running across the clearing. "Hurry up, Cindy! Hurry up, John!" Lucy carrying the baby, pulling the toddler. "We can hide in the bushes. Come along, hurry!" Several of the Indian outriders, however, saw them running across that clearing and galloped their ponies to cut off any escape. Then they demanded that Lucy yield up her 2 older children, 9-year-old Cynthia Ann and 6-year-old John, and even help hoist them up onto the ponies behind 2 of the warriors. The Indians took 5 captives that day, 2 women and 3 children. The 2 women would become Comanche slaves. The children would be more or less adopted by Comanche families. On that long ride away from all she'd ever known of home and family, Cindy Ann cried and prayed as her granddaddy had taught her. She prayed that some surviving family member would come and save them, or maybe even the Texas Rangers. But no one followed. At least, though she still had John to be big sister to, she still had that much of her family left. Then a few days out, Cindy Ann and John and the others were separated, taken to different camps, and Cindy Ann's real sense of loss overcame her. In the massacre at the fort, she had lost her father, her grandfather, her uncle, all now in the sod. And when she watched her brother riding off one way while she was going another, her last tie with the white world was cut forever. She lost her heritage, her people that day. She never lost as much but once. The Comanches in the Pinatucky camp welcomed the little captive girl, and she was given to a childless couple to raise as their own. She was given full tribal rights and a new name, Nadua, meaning she who keeps warm with us. Her new parents were not cruel to her, but she was expected to learn Comanche ways and to do her share of chores just as she had at the settlers' fort. She learned to scrape the buffalo hides and hang strips of buffalo meat on the drying racks, and she gathered wood and buffalo chips for the fire. She began to learn the Comanche language and to form attachments. Memories of her life at the fort began to fade, and she stopped hoping to be rescued by her family or even by the Texas Rangers. With the resilience of childhood, she found happiness again. She learned to ride, as every Comanche must, and she hunted for berries and wild honey and healing herbs. She came to revere the land as the Comanches did, and to love her new people. She thrived and bloomed into young womanhood, catching the eye of a respected warrior named Nocona, who brought 10 horses and many blankets to her father's teepee as a rich bridal price. Her father accepted the horses by running them in with his own, and Nadua and Nocona were married. Nocona took her north to his Quahati band, and they camped along the Canadian River and in the beautiful Palo Duro Canyon. There her first son was born, and she named him Fragrance. In the years that followed, she had 2 more children, another son and a daughter, and she was happy. On at least 2 occasions she had been spotted by white traders and military men who tried, in vain, to ransom her back for her white family. But she did not wish to go, and ran away in tears. The Comanches threatened the whites if they did not drop the subject, so, of course, they did. And once again Nadua felt secure in the knowledge that her people, this time her Comanche people, would protect her. But all that was to change one winter day, and Nadua would experience real loss for the second time. It was just past the middle of December in 1860. Nadua had been a Comanche for 24 years. Comanche warriors were having to hunt well into the winter now because the white buffalo hunters had so thinned out the buffalo herds with their sharp rifles. Nadua and the other women in the work party wait by the fire for the men to return from the day's hunt. Nadua is holding her baby daughter, Prairie Flower, close to her to shield the little girl from the blue norther blowing in over the plains. Then she sees a band of riders coming toward their camp near the Pease River. They carry flags, but not white ones. These are the flags of the 2nd Cavalry, and they accompany Sul Ross and the Texas Rangers. On a punitive raid, the soldiers and the Rangers ride into the camp, firing their weapons and killing everyone they see, mostly women and children. But Nadua, like her mother all those years before at Parker's Fort, has the presence of mind to run with little Prairie Flower in her arms, mount her horse, and ride into the wind. The soldiers pursue, and some say it was a young Irish lieutenant, others that it was Charles Goodnight himself, a young Ranger scout at the time, who's able to see when her buffalo robe blows back and she turns to look at her pursuer that she has blonde hair and blue eyes. He shouts, "Don't shoot her! She's white!" So her life is spared, but she is taken captive again. Her Parker relatives take her in and treat her kindly enough, except that they lock her in her room at night because she repeatedly tries to escape to get back to her husband and her sons. Oh, she helps with the chores, but in the evening she sits on the front porch holding Prairie Flower and looks toward the north and west as if she's waiting for Nocona to come and rescue her. But no one comes. She mothers little Flower as best she can, but 4 years after their capture by the Rangers, Prairie Flower comes down with a white man's fever and dies. And for the second time, Nadua's loss of family is complete. She never lost as much, but twice. Nadua responds to Prairie Flower's death as a Comanche. She slashes across her chest in mourning and slowly but deliberately starves herself to death in grief. She is given a white woman's funeral and buried with her Parker relatives in East Texas. Now only her firstborn son, Fragrance, in Comanche, Quanah, survives. Her husband, Peytonacona, refused treatment after he was wounded in battle and died from infection. Pecan, her second son, died with cholera, another white man's disease. It is Quanah Parker, he took his mother's family name to honor her, who becomes the last great war chief of the free Comanches. And his is another story. But in 1910, just shortly before his own death in 1911, he wrote to his Parker relatives asking that his mother's bones be returned to him at Fort Sill so that he could properly mourn her. At first they refused. Then his letter was read from a church pulpit in East Texas, and this is what the letter said in part. My mother, she fed me, carry me in her arms, put me to sleep. I play, she happy. I cry, she sad. She love her boy. They took my mother away, took Texas away, not let her boy see her. Now she dead. Her boy want to bury her, sit by her mound. My people, her people. We now all one people. The bones were sent to Fort Sill. Quanah Parker cut his braids and mourned, and a year later he was buried beside his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker Nadua, the white Comanche of the plains. When I was just a kid growing up in Amarillo, Texas, probably in the 3rd grade or so, I was a big fan of Roy Rogers, the king of the cowboys. Oh, I knew all about him. I knew his theme song, Happy Trails, and I listened to his radio show and read his adventure books and listened to his songs on those old 78 RPM records. And I went down to the Rex Theater on 6th Street every Saturday afternoon that one of his movies was the matinee feature. But I didn't have his autograph. At least not yet. I saw my chance, though, when I heard that Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, his wife and frequent co-star, were coming to Amarillo to appear at the annual Boys Ranch Rodeo on Labor Day weekend. Now, nearly everybody who came to Amarillo in those days stayed at the Herring Hotel downtown, and I figured that's where Roy and Dale would stay too. So one afternoon, on the day the rodeo was supposed to start, I called just to check. And the desk clerk said, yes, Roy Rogers was registered there, and would I like for him to ring Roy's room? I said, yes, sir, I guess so. And he did. But I was real glad when Roy didn't answer, because I don't know what I'd have said if he did. Well, when my mother got home from work at the H&Y drugstore, I told her it was really, really important for me to go down to the Herring Hotel and get Roy Rogers' autograph. See, I'd figured out that it'd be a whole lot easier to get Roy's autograph at the Herring than it would be at the rodeo, what with all those people and all. And besides, I knew my mother would be tired after working all day and wouldn't want to go to the rodeo anyway. My mother said okay. She would take me down there and drop me off, and I could call her when I got it, the autograph that is, and she'd come back and pick me up. Well, those must have been much more innocent days back then, I guess, because neither she nor I saw any great danger in our doing it that way. At first, though, of course, I had to get all dressed up in my best Western finery, and I don't mean just blue jeans and a Western shirt either, no, sir.
I had a real Western suit my daddy had given me for my birthday or Christmas, I forget which. It had tan gabardine pants and a short gabardine jacket with those little pointy designs off the shoulders and in the middle of the back. I wore a white shirt with mother-of-pearl snaps and had a bolo tie with a real turquoise on the slide, and a tulle leather belt with a horse's head on the silver-plated buckle, and boots, of course. Now, my boots weren't quite as pointy-toed as I might have liked, and the tops weren't very high, but that's okay, because my daddy said no real cowboy, Roy Rogers notwithstanding, ever wore his pants legs down inside his boots. Well, then finally I strapped on my guns, 2 of 'em. When we played cowboys in my neighborhood, I always got to be Roy Rogers because I had 2 guns and 2 holsters. My friend Janelle just had 1 gun and 1 holster, so she had to be Gene Autry. Since my guns were just for show on this trip, though, I unloaded 'em. I flipped up the side of the cartridge chamber there and carefully removed that roll of caps, the little circles of gunpowder showing through that red paper tape. My hat had a stampede string on it, but I tucked it up inside because for once in Amarillo the wind wasn't blowing. And I wasn't riding my horse to town after all. I wish I was, but I wasn't. I did have a horse, and I took her picture with me. That's what I was going to have Roy Rogers sign. My horse's name was Cutie Pie, but of late I'd started calling her Lady, after Roy Rogers's horse before he got Trigger. I bet you didn't even know he had a horse before he got Trigger, but he did. Like I say, I know all about him. See, I had it all figured out. When I handed him that picture, Roy would look at it and say something like, "My, that's a mighty fine-looking horse. Is that your horse?" And I'd say, "Yes, sir, and her name's Lady, just like your horse before you got Trigger. And she's a sorrel, too, just like your lady." And he'd say, "She sure is," or something like that. And the conversation would just go on from there. I hadn't quite worked the rest of it out in my head, but I knew it went on. When I got down to the Herring Hotel, Roy Rogers was nowhere to be seen, of course. He was still upstairs somewhere with Dale, I reckon. So I walked around the big old lobby and finally stood by the big fountain in the middle with the goldfish pond around it. But I stood always facing the elevators so I could watch and head Roy off when he and Dale came down. Now, there were some men there in the lobby, probably there for a convention or something, and they were hanging around, waiting for supper, I guess. I didn't pay much attention to them, but they must have been watching me while I was watching the goldfish and the elevator. Because when Roy and Dale finally did come down on that elevator and step out into that lobby, I couldn't move. I was frozen, rooted in place, and dumb, could not speak. Oh, my mind was working okay. I knew my chance was slipping away as Roy and Dale walked toward that big revolving door. But it was as if I were watching them and they were still up there on the silver screen, and I could not move. Well, then one of those convention men hollered out and said, "Hey, Roy, I think this little kid's been waiting on you." And Roy stopped just before he got to the revolving door. Only then, prodded, I'm sure, by the convention man, maybe even pushed, I was moving, in slow motion, it seemed to me, across the lobby to where Roy waited. I handed up the picture of my horse. And from that point on, everything speeded up. He took the picture, he signed it, he gave it back to me, and then he and Dale were gone. It happened that fast. No questions, no comments, no conversation. I turned and walked to the back of the lobby where the big wooden telephone booths were and called my mother. "I got it," I said. "You can come get me now." Then I waited over by the goldfish pond again. But I didn't care much about watching the goldfish. And I sure didn't need to watch the elevators anymore. I looked up at the convention man once, and he smiled. But I didn't smile back. I was still trying to sort out the reality from my illusions and figure out why, even though I had Roy Rogers's autograph right here in my hand, I was still disappointed. Oh, it'd be good for show and tell. And I have that autograph still. And don't get me wrong, I remained a Roy Rogers fan until, I don't know, at some point in my life I switched my allegiance to Doris Day. But I never did call my horse Lady after that. She was always just Cutie Pie. And it remained for us, for her and for me, to blaze our own happy trails.